Awesome. Hi guys, my name's James. How you guys doing? Okay, so just in case you didn't know, there's free beer in the back. I don't think you guys know, because the consensus is usually when there's like free beer at events, people get really excited. So I'm going to try one more time. How are you guys doing tonight? A little bit better. Okay, it's okay. So I'm here to talk to you guys about uniting designers and developers. Before I do, I just want to quickly thank the folks at DevTO for doing such an amazing job, tirelessly planning events month after month and doing such an amazing job of doing it. They helped me out a few months ago. If you guys were here, I talked about Space Apps Challenge. I was helping plan the event that was held, I believe it was in April. It feels like forever ago, but it also feels like last week at the Royal Ontario Museum. So thank you guys for being such a great supporter of technology in Toronto, as well as planning amazing events. Can we get a round of applause for that? And the second person I'd like to thank is Heather. Heather's amazing, and Ladies Leading Code is an amazing organization. I'd just like to say to the developers from my team, get to go and volunteer, and I can tell you that the experiences that they come back with and the things that they learn from teaching other people are incredible. So if you get bored during my conversation with you guys in the next little bit, please go onto your phones, check ladieslearningcode.com, find out how you can help out. You will not regret it. And Heather, thank you for doing such an amazing job. Toronto would not be Toronto without Ladies Learning Code. You guys have made a mark on us, and you've made us known as a place where we have a good community for technology, so thank you. Can we get another round of applause for her? And enough patting everyone in the back. So my name is James. I'm the founder and creative director of a team called The Fuse. We're a group of designers and front-end developers, and we focus on everything front-end. So we do websites, interfaces, and brands. We partner with a lot of back-end development shops, so we don't do that ourselves. And over the course of the last few years, what we've realized is that there's a big disconnect between design and development. And as we've kind of learned through failure and learned through success, the process that works best for us, the back-end development shops that we work with, what I thought I'd do with you guys today is share some of the experiences and some of the things that I've learned over the course of the last few years working with back-end development shops. And so when coming up with the idea of this talk and what I'd be talking about, I thought kind of ironically about the brain, which I have up here. So, funny joke. So up here's the brain. It's the inferior view of the brain, so it's the bottom-up view of the brain. I know nothing about brains, but we're going to try here. So I even labeled it, the brain, yeah. So the interesting thing about the brain is that it has the left and right hemisphere. The left hemisphere usually kicks in when you're thinking of more analytic things. The right side kicks in a little bit more when you're thinking of creative things. So the interesting part when you're relating a brain to designers and developers is design and development are sometimes segmented and split up and siloed. And sometimes they're thought of two different things, but in reality they rely on each other a lot, similar to the hemispheres of the brain. So the way that the brain works is, down the center over here, there's some nerve fibers, and those nerve fibers are called the corpus callosum. And so what I'd like to talk to you guys about today is how we can create some sort of corpus callosum with our own teams and get designers and developers to work together. And the idea is that if your brain wasn't, your left hemisphere of your brain wasn't to talk to your right hemisphere of your brain, you'd have mobility issues and you'd have health issues. A lot of issues, more than that, and I'm not going to even go into them. But that being said, we need designers and developers to talk to each other, to work with each other, to create amazing products. So before we kind of begin, I'd just like to say that this talk, even though I'm going to try to make it as general as possible for everyone, the background of this is I'm talking from experience with web consultancy, so we work with a lot of clients, from small businesses to large government organizations, and we work on client side mainly for web stuff that I'm going to talk about today. So hopefully the majority of these things will be able to be applied across most teams and everything else. And the interesting part, and while I'm actually touching on that, is this is an issue that I've seen not only in remote teams like ours or teams that don't have back-end resources or don't have design resources. This is across the board, even sometimes when you're sitting across the table from your developer, or as a developer, you're sitting across the table from your designer. So hopefully some things that you guys can take out of this. So before I begin, I just want to give the background of my history with design and development to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of kind of where development has gone in the last few years. And I'm sure many of you know this, but in the late 90s, early 2000s, when I was doing design to me was Microsoft Paint. It was Verdana and like 10 point, who remembers Verdana? it's still around, but, you know. Okay, so, and then marquees. And so marquees kind of go into development. Development for me back then was like table-based layouts. Awesome. So table-based layouts, and I remember I used to have a shared computer at home with like my parents and like my brother and stuff. And so what would end up happening is I would actually have a stack of sheets of paper that I would write on when I couldn't use the computer for whatever reason about like all these table-based layouts. And then I would transpose them, bring them back to my main computer and create websites and stuff. And then when CSS was popularized, I would have 2 stacks of papers, one for the div-based stuff, one for the CSS-based stuff. And you get my point. And so that was originally what I was doing, like these little static sites. And then I needed to figure out how to do like a little bit, you know, of sites with news and kind of a feed of some sort. So what I found was QPHP. It's still open source today, and you can find it. It's essentially a very lightweight CMS solution. And QPHP, when I found it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. Like, it can make like a news thing and like articles and stuff. And oh, and I was basically like copying other people's code. But I really thought that I knew how to use PHP. But I knew nothing about PHP. Because when WordPress came out, I was like, oh my god, this is amazing. And so again, we went through the like, documentation and all these plugins that were coming out, all this stuff that was going on. And so in WordPress, I started to realize I know even less about PHP. But when I figured out WordPress, I was like, oh my god, I know PHP, and now I've got to be the master of PHP. And I was doing all this over cute FTP, which was just like FTP, whatever, it doesn't matter. So the point of me kind of saying this is that as I started doing design and as I started doing development, I wasn't working with anyone else. I wasn't working with a team of designers and developers. It was me doing the entire thing. And I was working on static or news-based sites. So very simple sites, not applications. But for a lot of front-end developers and for a lot of designers, this is what they have experience working on. This is where they're coming from. They don't have the application knowledge all the time. They don't know how to work with Git or SVN or anything. They need you to teach them. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with this conversation. We need to work together. Design and development can't attack each other. They can't be on opposite sides. One of the things that I've learned from client services when working with back-end development shops is all the time we're on the same team. We're on the same side fighting the same fight with the client on our side. So we always need to make sure that we're figuring out ways to improve each other's processes. And so this kind of goes to a little bit of a story to kind of take things a little bit further. Because when I started working with application development, I was working with a team of back-end Ruby on Rails specialists called High Group. Last year, I guess, they got bought out by Big Nerd Ranch, if anyone knows about that stuff, in Atlanta, Georgia. But anyways, when I was working with High Group at the time on doing some application stuff, essentially this was the process. So a client with like, it says like, make the logo bigger, but you can't really see it. So anyways, funny joke, designers. Anyways, so when I first started working with a back-end development shop, there was the client, and there was a back-end development shop, and there was us. We're the Fuse. So when I first started working, you know, you create some wireframes, do some design, blah, 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 and then basically you'd get it to the client would approve it, and then we would chop it up into HTML, CSS. I would put it into a zip file. I would hand it over to the client would hand it over to the back-end development shop. And then the back-end development shop would turn that into some feedback. And they would say, you know, this needs to be changed, this doesn't work, yada, yada, yada. They would send that back to the client would then send it to us. And so it's a really, really bad process because then we would create another zip file with the same files that we originally sent, including the changes that we would end up sending right back to the client or right back to the back-end development shop. And so they would have to do diffs, and they would have to figure out what we changed, and they would have to do all this extra work just to implement our design and our front-end code. And so this was basically a huge mess. Will this work? Will this work? Oh, it won't work. Imagine a picture of, what's the main guy in like, Sheldon Cooper throwing papers in the air. That's what this was. And I blame that on Mavericks, just for anyone's, just in case anyone's wondering. So then what I decided to do is, looking back at this process, I was like, oh my gosh, this is the worst. Why are we making each other's lives more difficult when we can try to make it a little bit easier? So what I decided to do is change things up a little bit. This is by no means the end solution. We're going to keep going on it. But that being said, what I decided to do is realize that as client service solution providers, we were essentially working on the same team for the client. when the client was giving feedback to us from the developer, it was going through this broken telephone effect where we weren't getting the right feedback that we needed. And so we would end up having to have more conversations, more edits, take more time. It's a huge pain in the ass. So when we decided to work together, we would create that same zip file. Instead, we would send it directly to the back-end developers. The back-end developers would turn it into feedback. They would send it back to us. We would turn it into a zip file, and instead of sending all the files, we would send only the changed files. Or if it was small, very small changes, what we would do is I would manually figure out every change that I made, and I would tell them what change to make so that they can implement it, just to make their lives hopefully a little bit easier. And so we figured out this process, and again, Mavericks won't work, but that is a picture of the two Breaking Bad guys giving each other a high five. Anyways, I know nothing about Breaking Bad. But during this process, what I was learning more about as I was kind of going was that there were other tools and there are other ways of doing things that were more effective for people working on teams that I had never worked on before or never used before, like Git. I was learning about Terminal and how to push to something like GitHub, or how to install a Rails environment, which we were mainly working in Rails, and we still continue to mainly help out back-end development shops in Rails. So we were figuring out all these new things, and I had no idea that these things even existed. But the fact of the matter is that I needed help from the other side of the table. I needed to be able to not only show the initiative and put my hand out to say, I want to help you, but I also need the developers to come over and say, cool, let's figure this out. And they took hours upon hours of figuring things out with me, whether it be figuring out how to get the Rails environment set up, and it was a huge pain in the ass with screen sharing and everything else. Whether it was getting errors to pass, or whether it was actually getting the stuff that I was doing to show up properly, or telling me about this trick and this tool that I could use. So I needed that help from the other side of the table. And the other thing that I realized during this process is that a big disconnect between design and development is that developers think in terms of features. Designers think more in terms of pages. When you start thinking about that and start realizing how big of a deal that difference is, you're going to completely change your process. Because you'll start to realize, oh my goodness, maybe we haven't been talking the same conversation the entire time. And if you guys work with designers, or if there are any designers here that work with developers, you'll kind of know what I talk about, or what I'm talking about. So pages versus features. So what I'd like to do now is talk you through a little bit of the process that we have now. So it's going to be a little bit more specific. I'm going to try to go through as much as possible, because I know I don't have a lot of time up here, and I want to make sure you guys get a lot. That being said, we'll have questions at the end, and I'll be around for a little while as well if you have any specific questions about any of the stuff that I'm going to talk about. So during the course of a client project, generally the first thing we do is, besides scoping and everything, is finding out who the back-end development team that is working on the project is. That's the most crucial part of what we do. Find out who they are and have a conversation with them. And it isn't a conversation that we're trying to attack them or try to judge them or find out, I think a lot of the times when technologists go into, or developers and designers alike, go into conversations with other people in our industry, we automatically go to attacking them and trying to find the bad in them, find the good in them, find out what they do really well, find out what language they're using. As soon as you start finding out, what language they're using, version control, whether they're going to be setting up a staging environment or production environment, talking about, whether they've had any good experiences working with designers before. Those are the sorts of conversations that we have as a design shop to a development team. And so we expect them as well to become a part of our process, because again, we're on the same side fighting the same fight with the client. We need to make sure that it's not two segregated teams. So every piece of work that we do, we expect developers to be a part of, and similar, we expect our designers to be a part of their development process. So the first thing is conversations. Then we use Basecamp. You can use whatever you want for this, but we use Basecamp, and it's just our preferred tool. We use discussions, to-do lists, and it's by no means perfect. Discussions, to-do lists, and milestones are in there. And what we try to do is keep everything documented there, especially in the initial parts of the process. We start conversations with the developer. The developer is in Basecamp right alongside our designers, notified on messages, just so that they know what's going on. It's similar to having the person straight across the table from you and just telling them, hey, take a look at this. but sometimes they don't get that. So sending them an email notification through Basecamp is great, and being able to touch base with them maybe once a week if you haven't heard from them to see what they're thinking is great. And then as our designer is working on anything from sitemaps in IA, whether it be personas, whether it be wireframes, the developer is a part of that process, and similarly giving us an extra set of eyes, which is amazing because even though we have development advocates, which I'll talk to in a minute, essentially we can now get a back-end development specialist looking at what we're working on, not only ensuring that the scope is correct and that we're not adding anything that's completely, bonkers or anything like that. They're actually a part of the process giving us feedback, and that's a huge part of what we do and something that we rely a lot on. So that's a big part of it. And then once we get to the design and finished designs and we're getting it off to front-end development, what we'll do right away before we even start a code of front-end development is have a kickoff call with the back-end developer. And generally, the first conversation that you have with a back-end developer might not necessarily, especially if you're working with a back-end development shop, might not necessarily be the actual developer you're working with. So this is crucial because the way that the whole company might operate might actually be different than the specific person you're working with. So at this point, you'll ask more specific questions. And the first question that I generally want everyone to ask is, how can I get in touch with you, like, right now? What's the best way of getting in touch with you? Is it email? Because email sucks. Email isn't instant. How can we create the face-to-face conversation online or in whatever other way? Is it just picking up the phone and calling? Is there specific hours that you work? Do you like Skype? Do you like Google Hangouts? Do you like Facebook Messenger, ICQ, AIM? Whatever they use, make sure that you guys figure a way to get involved in each other's daily lives by pinging each other to death when you guys need something, especially if there's a block or anything else. And then the how to work together is the other thing. Like, do they want you, as a designer, we need to know whether the developer wants us to be pushing into the same repo, whether we should be on the same branch or a different branch, whether we should be making pull requests. Like, all of these different things that we need to know that developers, hopefully you can teach us, and hopefully you guys know what your preferences are to make your lives easier. And again, we're on the same side. We're trying to make sure that we can all focus on what we're good at. So the thing that, one of the things that we use sometimes because, as like I was saying, designers focus on pages, clients kind of focus on pages a lot as well, as opposed to features unless they're very, very progressive. But when we're doing this, what we try to do is actually, we've started using something called Middleman. Middleman is a static layout generator. Tessa, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. Built on top of Compass and, right?
Sinatra.
Sinatra, damn it! So built on top of Sinatra, corrected. Built on top of Sinatra, and what it allows us to do is just create layouts. And in static HTML, CSS, when you're doing this, and you have to change like a nav bar item, it's a big pain in the ass when you have like 50 pages. So Middleman helps us do that, as well get things set up so that when we're going on to development, when we're moving things into back-end development and implementing things, we've already got things for more or less set up. So the other thing that we like to look at is test suites. So test suites, if you're not testing, you should be testing. But I'm sure everyone has heard that already. That being said, designers can test things too, especially front-end developers. So if you have a test suite, tell a designer how to operate the test suite. Tell them how it works. If you want them to be creating their own tests, tell them how it works. So figuring that stuff out, but also being able to be there for troubleshooting, helping when a test doesn't pass or anything else. That's huge. And then the next thing that we go into is Pivotal Tracker. I put Pivotal Tracker here because it's our preferred tool, but Trello, Asana, whatever, all those things work just the same. That being said, when it comes to development, especially back-end development, things are moving a lot quicker. So now these features are being created in Pivotal Tracker or whatever tool you're using. And so we as designers and front-end developers need to know what's going on. And as well, when a developer needs to create a task, say it's a bug or anything else, they should be able to do it in the same place that they're already working, as opposed to having to jump back into Basecamp, creating a task, and doing everything else. So they're in the same place that they're working all the time. And so that allows a little bit more fluid conversation, quicker conversation. So Pivotal Tracker is huge for us. And then the last thing is avoiding blockers as much as possible. So generally what happens in front-end development is we can get blocked very easily by back-end development by an API key changing, or the README file not being up to date, or any one of a number of reasons. So if we have those things, figuring out ways to get ahead of ourselves for front-end development, sometimes it's so simple as codepen.io and figuring out all the styles for things and just quickly coding something up that can be brought over later. And for back-end development, there might be just certain ways that we can figure out in that early kickoff call to make sure that things aren't blocked for back-end development. And there's conversations constantly going on. This whole process that I'm talking about is iterative. This is not the final. Our process changes based on what back-end development shop we're working with. What I'm trying to talk about today, and trying to hopefully encourage everyone to do, is go back to your teams, whether it be tonight, because you guys are late-night workers, or tomorrow, or whenever you go back to your teams, have a conversation on how to improve things. You might have a certain process that's working right now, but what I really encourage everyone to do is figure out better ways to improve your process, to make each other's lives easier. Because ultimately, if you can take something from someone else's hands that they are not as specialized in as you are, and make their lives easier, then you've done a good job at the end of the day. So that's pretty well my presentation. That's all I really had to say. Again, remember, figure out the corpus callosum, figure out how your process works with whoever you're working with, especially when it comes to designers. We're a fickle being, but we do like working together, and we just need that encouragement and help. And that is it. So thank you guys.